ভিউটা দিতে বলছে, ভিউ দেওয়া যাচ্ছে না তো এখানে।
ভিউ মানে
ওই যে দিতে হয় না স্ক্রিনে ভিউ, এইখানে স্ক্রিনে ভিউটা দিতে বলছে।
হ্যালো, হ্যাঁ কিটা ওটাই তো বেরিয়ে গেছেন, দাঁড়ান দেখছি।
কি
হুম,
কিরে?
হ্যাঁ ওই ইয়েকে জয়েন করতে বলো, স্পিকারকে। হুম হুম, হ্যাঁ ঠিক আছে।
বৈশাখী মুখ গেল। ম্যাম আছেন তো? ঠিক আছে ঠিক আছে ঠিক আছে, নেটওয়ার্ক চলে গেছে।
কি করবেন? দেখো দেখো জয়েন হলো নাকি দেখো। না হয়নি। হ্যালো, হ্যাঁ এসে গেছেন এসে গেছেন। কিসে?
Good
Good evening, all of you,
my dear
my dear friends.
Today,
Second day of faculty development program
on
on
museum,
museum, archives, art, architecture, and tourism. Today's speaker,
Dr.
Boishakhi Mitra,
Head of
Head of the Department
and
and Curator in charge Department of Museology, Rabindra Bharati Museum, Rabindra Bharati University.
First of all, I heartily welcome her. And also I request her to highlight upon strategic museum management need of the hour. So I would like to request Dr. Boishakhi Mitra to present her topic, specialist strategic museum management need of the hour. I heartily welcome to Dr. Boishakhi Mitra.
Thank you, Professor Dan. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. The topic that you just read out was the broad area I mentioned I would like to talk upon. But right now I have specified one unit of the strategic management area, which is community museums, global development, local need. Now the thing is, yesterday I realized many of the participants in this seminar were from outside Bengal, and they were having problem when we are talking in Bengali. So taking the permission of the organizing committee, I would like to continue in English if it is not a problem. I'm sure everybody would be able to understand. That's not an issue with us.
Of course, ma'am.
Okay. So firstly, of course, thank you so much for inviting me to deliver this talk. Another thing, we are having very heavy showers in my place. So in case I go offline, just give me a minute to reconnect through another portal. Okay? If that happens at all. So thank you for letting me talk on a topic which is very close to my heart, museums and communities, and an area on which I have been working on for the past many years now. And this is a great way of museums, how museums can render social service to the people that it serves. What I will be speaking of today is from my experience as a Fulbright postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Anthropology at Smithsonian Institution, where I extensively worked with the minority communities in the USA. Now, this is a very different kind of America that I worked in. It's not the white America that we know of. It is the black America, it's the America of the native Indians. And it's very different from the stereotyped America that we see. So I'll also be briefly touching upon similar developments in some other countries. And for better understanding, I have decided to divide up my lecture, since this will be a pretty long lecture, divide up my lecture into 3 parts. In the first part, I'll talk about the discourses and the discussions that shaped the integration of communities with museums. Let me go into my PowerPoint. So can you all see the PowerPoint? Hello? Is the PowerPoint visible?
No, ma'am.
No, ma'am.
No. Yes, it is visible.
It
Yes.
is visible?
Yes, yes.
Mala, can you see it?
Yes.
So it's visible.
Okay.
Okay, ma'am. Okay.
Okay, it's okay. So now I can
Okay.
go now. Okay. So in the first part, I'll talk about the discourses that shaped the integration of communities with museums. In the second part, I'll take you through some very important developments in community empowerment with the help of museums in different countries, with special focus on the US. Why US? Because it's these museums that I worked in practically, and I'll be able to give you a lot of information outside the book that is available. So, and in the third and the final part, I'll try to explore similar situations that are gently developing in India also. Now, as most students of museology know, modern museums metamorphosed from the Museum of Alexandria, a museum prototype in the 3rd century BC, and it was set up by Ptolemy Sotters. Here I show you a slide of that museum, and as you can see, there is no question of display or exhibition here. What they are basically doing is gathering things and arranging and keep storing them in a proper way. That was all. That is the reason we call it a museum prototype. Subsequently, museums took various forms, from John Tradescan's Cabinets of Curiosities. Here we have a slide of the Cabinets of Curiosities of John Tradescan. And why we call it a Cabinets of Curiosities is because these men, they gathered things that were strange or that they found very appealing. And here we see for the first time some kind of exhibition or some kind of display attempted. So the next step from gathering is the incipient attempt of displaying the museum elements there. Now this happened in Britain. Parallelly, some years later in the US also, the evolution continued, with Charles Wilson Pilley's Philadelphia Museum developing a kind of storage, display, as well as some kind of museum visit. But museums, even though it seems static entities, are not really so. So what we see is that they are in fact quite dynamic, and they had responded to changing social needs. The metamorphosis of this institution till the early 19th century was slow but steady. From being storehouses of antiquities of the rich and powerful, they moved on to take upon themselves the role of public institutions devoted to conservation of cultural heritage. While their traditional functions remained rooted in collection, preservation, and display, the general public was allowed within their threshold only to be awed by the collection. So the public really didn't have a major role in these museums. It was the collectors' museums. However, even in the early 20th century, museum visitors were regarded as passive entities, and education was not one of the primary aims of the museums, which later changed. Now, what happened? As I just said, museums were static entities at the beginning. They were mere collections of the rich and the powerful and had no real role in public service. Is how these institutions changed in their missions and visions after World War II. In little more than a generation, museums transformed from being primarily inward-looking organizations concerned chiefly with the preservation and study of their collections into predominantly outward looking organizations whose stated intent was to provide service to the public. So this was a new paradigm shift for the museums in those days. As the post-World War II museums responded to a changing global situation, a flurry of activities was seen in those museums belonging to the progressive societies of Europe and America. During the 1950s and 1960s, for the first time, museum education was added to its existing list of functions. The next global development was the environmental movement peaking in the 1970s, which triggered the next change in museums when they responded once again by evolving into eco-museums that were closely linked with ecology and for the first time involved participatory management involving the local people. Thus began the democratization of museums and an institution that had so far been conceived, controlled, and cherished by the religious and political powers, and which came under the control of the educated common man finally. Now, let us take a brief look at the eco museums. Why is it that eco museums are so important? Eco museums are linked to the environmental conservation movement that I just told you about, and it was an offshoot of the new museology. It was the brainchild of George Henry Rivera, a celebrated French museologist and a pioneer architect of eco museums in France. While it started in France in 1960s, later on it spread all over Europe and Canada and America and Latin America, and now you find it in many countries. And unfortunately, India is yet to have one good eco museum of her own. Now, the term eco museum was later coined by another French museologist, Hugh de Barry, and the prefix eco that you see there is from the environmental movement ecology. The eco museum model that I'm going to show you now compares the traditional museum with the eco museum. As you can see from the slide, the traditional museum has a building, it has a collection, it has specialist curator, and it has visitors. However, an eco museum is spread over a far vast area of land, and it has residents, proper living residents. It has a core museum, but everything in there is a living heritage kind of thing. Visitors are always welcome to visit it, but the museum exists as much for the resident as for the visitors. So this is the development of the late 20th century. Now, the advantages of the eco museum model is that it takes a holistic approach to the preservation of folk and tribal heritage, and it puts equal emphasis on cultural as well as on natural assets. It does not follow any essential monolithic model and is not a pre-constituted entity. Hence, it can be adapted to unique socio-cultural needs required for folk traditions or rural traditions. And the right of the ownership of culture is with the local people. So what happens in the bigger museums like the Indian Museum or the National Museum or the Louvre, British Museum, here we have a few very highly qualified people sitting with their bow ties and with their suits and saying, okay, we are going to interpret the common heritage. But the common heritage belongs to a different kind of people, and they would like to interpret it like themselves. This is only possible in an eco museum or in a community museum setup. So here you see a slide of a community museum project in Croatia. The other advantages of eco museum is that it focuses on objects, buildings, wildlife, and other tangible assets, to include also the music, ceremonies, traditions, and other aspects of intangible heritage. And it aims to preserve and interpret heritage assets, but they also work to apply this knowledge to address local developmental issues with a focus on sustainability, which is very important because tourism comes in a big way for eco museums also, which I will show you in some later slides. And finally, all the assets associated with the eco museum continue to live, and they are not put behind glasses as in traditional museums. Here we see a folk festival in the eco museum in France. So you can see how lively it is. Now this, after the development of eco museums, the important thing is that the this global scenario, it continued to change. Now it continued to change. Why? Because there were certain social and political upheavals happening in the world. What were they? Number one, that there was a globalized competition where multinational companies were competing with each other for every available bit of profit. There was also a demographic shift in the world population because increasing mobility of people for purpose of business, labor, migration and studies meant that the shift started from the time of industrialization, and the process of distancing of people further and further away from their source communities continued since then. This distancing of workers intensified, especially after 1974 and the oil crisis. Since that time, and certainly during the last couple of decades of the 20th century, there has been great trends towards short-term contracts, job shares, job splits, and part-time work, with the result that intermixing of populations occurred readily. This was further affected by a boom in the electronic technology, with people across the globe being brought close together, especially through the telecommunication systems. The development of this postmodern world was immensely influenced initially by the radio and the cinema, and then more importantly during the post-World War periods by the television, and more recently by the satellite television and the smartphones. These media of mass communication have facilitated the removal of cultural boundaries and have helped to remove difference between varied and rich cultures all over the world, with the effect that the trend towards homogenization of culture accelerated, resulting in formation of hybrid identities and cosmopolitan cultures. The museum audience right now is very fragmented, and the audience has new identities evolved. So if an Indian migrant worker in the Middle East or Britain and or Australia is no longer just an Indian, he or she has a much more complex cultural identity. Increasingly, museums realized that their visitor diversity implied not only difference in respect of gender, age, and education, but also in origin and in multiple identities. Now, it is beyond the scope of this lecture to go into the theory of cultural hybridity, but those of you who may want to know more of the concept will find the book The Location of Culture by Homi Bhabha very useful. So do go through it. While most of us in the developing countries criticize globalization, fearing it may destroy our culture, the result was quite the opposite. With increasing homogenization, ethnic groups and cultural identities became aware of their uniqueness and attempted to protect it fiercely. This led to a tremendous blossoming of cultural expressions amongst indigenous people and and other ethnic minority groups, with claims to institutional ownership of heritage resources being increasingly challenged. With the United Nations General Assembly proclaiming 1995 to 2004 and then again 2005 to 2014 as the International Decade of the World's Indigenous People, the role of museums in portraying the minority voices came under scanner. It was increasingly felt that human culture is the property of all and can make their appeals without experts in the middle. For example, the way the ethnological artifacts are displayed in the museums were for the first time criticized during this period. If you visit any anthropological museum in India or anywhere else, you will see that the tribal life has been decontextualized from the everyday life of source communities. And this has resulted in the creation of beautiful displays, no doubt, which actually do not fit with the ethnic identities. It is the same situation all across the world, where ethnic histories have been mostly interpreted by non-ethnic experts. Fortunately, this trend began to change as indigenous people emerged as a force to be reckoned with, first in international forums like the United Nations, and then in the politics of advanced settler communities. This resulted in some dramatic and groundbreaking developments in the museum world, with indigenous rights activists vigorously formulating laws that require repositories to repatriate or return human remains and religious objects to indigenous communities. This drive for control of cultural representation was reflected in two ways. First, there was a rise in community involvement in the programs of the larger museums. So the minority communities were asked to come in and give their opinions regarding the displays in the larger museums. And the second, there was a rise in the number of local heritage museums. This is very interesting to note. So for the first time, we have small local heritage museums coming up in different parts of the world, especially in areas which have thick ethnic population. The major change which affected a paradigm shift is the functioning of a museum was the introduction of the innovative social entrepreneurship model, which was developed by Professor J. Gregory Dees of the Harvard Business School in the early 1990s, and the theory brought new light into museum management. The pattern which Stephen Well described as a new and potentially dominant model for museums grew from its legitimacy from what a museum does rather than what it is. In his seminal article From Being About Something to Being For Somebody, Well puts extreme emphasis on a museum's outward rather than inward focus. It is a model that seems strikingly different from the most of the earlier ones that museums have followed. It is applicable across the entire spectrum of non-profit organizations and concentrates on organizational outcomes, impacts, and results. If you take a look at the diagram that I have put on the slide, you'll see the social enterprise model, which is the blue circle, takes a bit from the business for-profit business strategies and a little bit from the non-profit social missions. So in a social enterprise model of museum management, we find both business strategies as well as social missions. Among museum workers, the response to this ongoing change in museum was mixed. A minority section views it with distress. They don't like it. They argue that museums were already mature institutions in no compelling need for further change. However, there is a huge part of the museum who are museum's evolution from a collection-based organization to a more socially focused one. They characterize the museum as similar in some measures to the university, where the museum is seen as a transformed and redirected institution that can, through its public service orientation, use its very special qualities in dealing with objects to improve the quality of individual human lives and to enhance the well-being of the community. So Professor Dees' social entrepreneurship model was an important movement in the direction of forming what we now call post-museums. Post-museums and speeded up the... Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Hello?
Yes, ma'am.
Continue,
please.
Okay, thank you. So this helped in the development of the post-museums, and it speeded up the process of development of decentralized museums. Although the concept of museum was born in Europe, Eileen Hooper Greenhill in 2000 had predicted that the post-museum movement would grow its roots elsewhere. And this prediction has been so true. Such museums based on principles of new museology grew in large numbers in the Americas, in Mexico, Brazil, Canada, and the USA. But what made the post-museum movement in the US unique was the country's multi-ethnic demography with a large immigrant population and a substantial number of minorities with local historical memory of sufficient depth, a situation lacking in most European countries. In no other countries did the museums face as challenging a job as in the US. Many US museums defied Eurocentric colonial models and formed their own idea of what a museum should be, that is, oriented to the community. So summing up, this fundamental is to what has been said till now is that the belief that museums should be in service to society and that it has a primary social role. Its task is no longer to transmit a universal message to an undefined audience, but to put the local population in contact with their history, traditions, and values. Through its activities, the museum contributes to the community's awareness of its own identity. As stated by Nancy Fuller, Today, many museums have become vehicles of community empowerment, keeping up with the trend discussed above. Museums all across the world are taking different forms and actions to justify their existence within their communities. Museums are changing. Till now, we are taking a look at the discourses that shaped the post-museum movement across the world. Now we will go into the case studies that I have worked with in the States. Historically speaking, can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I'll go on. Historically speaking, in the US, the first voice to be raised in this regard was more than 100 years ago by George Brown Good. In his article, The Museums of the Future in 1891, this zoologist and museum administrator clearly said the museum should be adapted to the needs of the mechanic, the factory operator, the day laborer, the salesman, the clerk, as much as to those of the professional man. The People's Museum should be much more than a house full of specimens in glass cases. It should be a house full of ideas. This was much before Andre Malraux, the French historian or the cultural politician, came up with the concept of imaginary museum or a museum without walls. It was also much before the International Council of Museum or the American Association of Museum was formed. Following him, more than 25 years later, it was John Cotton Dana, the American library and museum director, who in his legendary writing, The New Museum, while reiterating Good's vision of service to the general public, also emphasized the importance of service to the community. For Dana, it was only a matter of time before the management of every museum would come to its common sense and realize that its most promising future lay not in mindlessly amassing ever more objects, but in providing a full and rich utility to its community. This was in 1917. The Second World War followed in 1939 and ended in 1945.
Please share your screen, ma'am. Please share your screen. Screen not visible.
Screen not visible?
Please present. No.
Okay, just wait.
আসেনি এখনো?
এসছে?
Yes.
Okay.
Ma'am, yes. Okay.
ঠিক আছে।
Okay, ma'am. Okay.
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 So the Second World War followed, and the most remarkable period of museum development happened soon after, with a flurry of activities in the museum world as new museums were set up with specific educational roles to serve the public. Educational activities became an important part of every museum, and then museums serving a specific community was rare. This was by the US civil rights movement. As you know, right now also the Lives Matter movement is going on. But this started from the 1970s. So the rights movement of the 1960s focused attention on cultural needs of the ethnic community. The civil rights 64, which prohibited and banned employment basis of race, color, religion, gender, or nationality. Achievements of the system. This awareness began growth of community and the making of traditional in the United States as activists empowerment and a sense of cultural connectedness. Realize that the community museums often provide a broader range of activities than the traditional European which we follow in India, including the visual arts of the exhibit. Of museum cases move beyond racism and repatriations and cultural property. Museums into agents of social change. museum movement was two minority groups in the US, African American community and American Indian community. The College Museum on the Black community was set up in Hampton, Virginia in 1868 as the first African American museum in America. By 1950, there were more than 30 museums devoted primarily to African American culture and history in the United States. Located primarily at historically black colleges and universities, these museums followed the traditional museum model and didn't have any role in social change other than collecting black artifacts. The first independent museum on black history and culture was the African American Museum of Cleveland, founded in 1953, that served as an institution that provided cultural and education about black history. In addition to a collection of artifacts that represented a holistic view of African diasporic experience, the museum also organized community events. Throughout the 1960s, the energy of the American civil rights movement led to numerous local African American museums being founded. Started in 1961, the DuSable Museum of African American History became a Chicago landmark. The collection was housed in the living room of Margaret Taylor Burroughs and her husband Charles. So it was not a very big museum, it was a small museum, but it represented the ethnic identity. And it was then called the Ebony Museum of Negro History. It was one of the few independently owned museums of black culture in the United States that was created to preserve, study, and teach black history and art. In 1976, the African American Museum in Philadelphia became notable as the first museum funded and built by a municipality to help preserve, interpret, and exhibit the heritage of African Americans. By 1991, there were about 150 African American museums established in the 37 states of the US. But the most remarkable of all these museums was by far the Anacostia Neighborhood Museum, where I had the opportunity to work, which broke away from all traditional museum model and became a pioneer in its own right in the museum community. While the civil rights agitators were making big waves in Washington, D.C., the Anacostia Project became a beacon of solidarity with its radical. The museum as an outreach in itself, an American community, and it was starting the secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. He proposed the setting up of the first community museum in the US. Under the leadership of John Kin, a local activist and a minister, ambitious and innovative. At the heart of Kinrad's policy and philosophy were the idea of community participation and excellence. John Kinrad lamented that museums are responsibilities that go beyond collecting. He wanted to encompass the life of the people of the neighborhood, people who are vitally concerned about who they are, where they came from, what they have accomplished, their values, and their most pressing needs. Its founding director, Kinrad, employed his skills in community engagement, organizing and outreaching to shape the practice and direction of the museum. Established in 1967, the museum became a center to the cultural and educational needs of the residents of the area, that is the local community. With this vision in mind, the Anacostia Community Museum formed its mission statement, which said, "The Anacostia Neighborhood Community Museum explores social issues impacting diverse populations of the DC metropolitan area to promote mutual understanding and strengthen community bonds." The museum even had a social impact statement, a rare thing for museums in the 1960s, which stated that the museum is of, for, and by the people. It promotes the coming together of diverse people and perspectives to learn from, empower, and uplift one another to create a more tolerant, unified metropolitan story. The Anacostia Neighborhood Museum even had a tagline. They said, "Your community, your story." Just go through their this resolution, and you'll see that nowhere does the mission statement talk about collections and objects. What it talks about is what work the museum is going to do for its community. Soon after its inception, the Anacostia Museum organized a path-breaking exhibition. It was not an exhibition on high-end culture, nor one on showcasing exotic heritage, but one on rats. Called The Rats, the Man's Invited Affliction, the exhibition explored rodent infestation and reflected the interest of an urban neighborhood battling an increasing problem. Kinrad had actually gone out to the community and asked them, what is the most important issue for you right now? And they said that rats, because that is the thing that is causing the biggest headache to the community. And he came back and he did an exhibition with on the rats. The show included a simulated environment of a backyard with live rats. It was an innovative exhibition exploring contemporary problems of rat
Ma'am, sound is
infestation
not
in
clear,
urban
ma'am.
areas, and it surprised many serious.
Ma'am, please.
Hello?
Ma'am, sound is not
Hello?
clear, ma'am.
Ma'am, sound is not
Sound
clear,
is
ma'am.
not clear, ma'am.
Sound is not clear, ma'am.
Okay,
Sound.
okay, I'll try. Wait.
Sound is not clear, ma'am.
Sound is not clear, ma'am.
না না সাউন্ড ঠিক আছে,
Okay, okay.
সাউন্ড ঠিক আছে,
Okay.
ক্লিয়ার হচ্ছে,
Okay, okay. Ma'am, start.
কন্টিনিউ করো।
Okay, okay.
One second.
Ma'am, continue.
শোনা যাচ্ছে শোনা যাচ্ছে
শোনা যাচ্ছে, কন্টিনিউ করুন।
Okay. ঠিক আছে, দেখা যাচ্ছে?
ওকে ওকে।
So it was an innovative exhibition exploring contemporary problems of rat infestation in urban areas, and it surprised many serious museologists. The rat exhibition was a huge success, and it traveled across the United States and led to a television documentary on the topic. Now, for those who are interested in Kinrad's movement, you can go through this book, The Man, the Movement, the Museum. It's the journey of John R. Kinrad as the first African American director of a Smithsonian Institution museum. It's written by his daughter, Dr. Joy Kinrad, where she speaks about her father's intuitive genius and willingness to defy the museum world's standards and assumptions. In 2006, Anacostia Neighborhood Museum was renamed the Anacostia Community Museum. Today, the US has a network of African American museums where community engagement is an important part of their daily routine. My presentation will remain incomplete if I do not mention the growth of museums among other minority populations in the US. Parallel to the growth of museums of African Americans, there was also gentle movements in setting up museums dedicated to the Latino and to the Asian communities. The El Museo del Barrio was founded in 1969 as a place of cultural pride and self-discovery for the founding Puerto Rican community. By young people to this culture, El Museo, the next generation, while satisfying the growing interest of Caribbean art among national audience. Museums strive to enhance sense of identity, self-esteem, and self Caribbean and Europe. The other Latin are doing wonderful job for communities. Sol, Victor, and the Asian diaspora are behind it. There was African Museum in 1987. The Chinese American release in 2000, and more recently in the Indo-American up in Chicago. All these museums are highly connected and contribute reinforcing the cultural identities of the conserve, thus empowering. The next case study to take you of the Native American movement, there are new growing attempts by another minority who have exterminated from their own, the Native Americans. With over 500 recognized tribes of the American Indians, raised a strong recognition. But the first museum in Indian heritage one by the ethnic group. The first American collection was is by George Gustave in 1960 of American Indian. Collection was that of Museum at Three that was established 12 years later in 1999. Collection by the appreciated native culture. Native cultural objects are placed in museums by non-Indians and largely for non-Indians. From a native perspective, these displays reinforced stereotypes because they focused on and often distorted the nature of life. However, the Indian Reunification Act of 1934 allowed the Native Americans to recover their cultural heritage, sought to promote tribal self-development, and paved a new way for social empowerment among. On May 2, 1938, the Osage Nation Museum at Oklahoma, the oldest tribally owned museum in the US, came into being. Soon several tribes in the Midwest and cultural centers that were owned and managed by the tribes themselves. These centers became an integral part of the cultural renaissance in native communities. Today there are over 150 tribal museums in the United States, including several in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. I had the good fortune to visit many of these tribal museums. However, it will not be possible for me to tell you all the stories. I'll focus on only a few that I had really amazed me. One of the earlier tribal museums that needs special mention is the Makkah Museum and Cultural Center at Nia Bay. An archaeological discovery at the Osage village in 1970 led to the founding of this museum in 1979. Oral testimonies, elders' history, participant observation, and archival research wove a vivid portrait of a cultural center that embodied the self-image of a Native American community. The museum is totally administered and curated by the Makkah tribal members under the watchful eyes of 12-member Makkah Board of Trustees. Film here to put on you listen to the messages of Makkah tribe.
Peninsula has been the Native American tribe. Just Olympic National Parks proudly displayed the museum public in 1979 what was in North America. An archaeological site unearthed 8 homes that were perfectly preserved by a mudslide 5 years ago.
Well, this period of rest was in whole lifestyle because it is in.
With 55 artifacts recovered, our museum is the center of these archaeological discoveries, enabling it to recreate God's rich history as hunters and warriors. The exciting part of the museum is the village truck.
The chief scientist. You want to recount? Where?
The museum also full-scale replica of a 15th century longhand, including the original and a replica whale carving adorned with seashells. With such detail, the museum is an incredible recreation of what life would be like in the village of Osage in the 15th century.
We've always kept our church. We've always known our heritage.
museum and cultural. The next museum that I would is the Zuni Ashwi Center in New Mexico in the United States. It was in but yet community, not for profit, with project on their past, current, and future. The building itself is a construct the traditional weapons to perpetuate younger generation. Garden is unique and tools are used. During the September, the museum invites Zuni members to participate in every step of, along with museum staff, the soil, plant, water, and crops. The garden attempts extension of the gallery space, installation that way. Gardening practices immunity, experience a healthy Zuni life. But the best involvement is out there in Himdak Eco Museum, which was set up in 1996. 372,000 of the Gila River community. The first museum in the US. People have cultivated thousands of years. Everything, the people, land, the buildings in the region, it's part of their. Even the police and the center for seen regarded to be a museum is a true museum that is only on. A request is a but the reason for the museum is the Akchin community itself. By storing and artifacts in their archives, the Himdak cultural education and generations and lives. The function of the museum is free of display are photographs in the an oral project that was by the museum. Fortune to speak with Eileen Peters, the museum director, an insight into the museum's mission. In some instances, said the activities of the museum, the immediate cultural goals, and dealt with issues of social and political importance. Areas are not traditional subjects of museum exhibition, but Akchin Himdak has shown that museums must change with time to respond to the public. It was very when they were carrying awareness program because the community members, especially the senior, huge. So through increased community-oriented participatory management, the Akchin Himdak has become a sign of pride and self-respect community. Some slides of this is the Mudar community is also very large. Here you see the interesting thing to see is that you don't see the American anywhere inside the museum. The 8 behind at the back wall belong to the 8 tribe American Gila River. American identity is dominant idea. American Indian Museum, and all of them come from. There are no white from outside. This is the Akchin language is very, and this is their way of keep the language. Asia had much more time to go through all the exhibitions, but they are doing such a wonderful work. Young generation of the learning the traditional Akchin dance of the Native American tribes. Now, my talk on community museums is incomplete if I don't go to some other countries which are doing excellent work, community museums, and the which comes to the top of my mind is Mexico, where they have this museum network. It's not enough museums. Museum since 1980s, there are more than spread over 6 states in Mexico. Mobilization, empowerment of investment of local government, durable partnerships with society. And you can see this museum. One bottom left, garage in our museum for the community. Do oral history to be preserved by. This one is in Brazil. Too, not as a museums, community museums, where the local participation is mandatory. We have Taiwan Community Museum. Museum can be a means to reap life and values, activity, vision. So how are these museums unique? These museums are unique because they seek to reflect community perspectives and local or alternative history and genealogy. Unique because they reiterate the values and character of communities, run on shoestring budget and with very few staff. They double up as cultural centers as well. So most of them are called museums as well as cultural centers, where they positive connotations and carry a slightly different thing than the usual museum. Their culture is a multifunction organization. It's active and it's a thriving place where community can celebrate its. And these museums have integrated with their communities in a much more coherent way than bigger museums could. Now, the obvious question that arises to mind: do we have anything of this sort in India? Well, we do. The Kshatriya museums of Assam, if you go back to the museums have been functioning for many years now as Vaishnavite centers and dealing with tangible and intangible heritage. And they are completely centered on the community. There are many of these shortcomings throughout Assam. The other community museum that we can talk about is the Korlai Community Eco Museum, which was established by B.H. Vedan in 1999. This is the first eco museum set up in India, and it was aimed to save the culture and heritage of a small chawl in Maharashtra. Especially the endangered it was protecting was the Korlai. Like that, the folk history, literature, and rituals were stored in the museum. More recently, two kinds of museums developed in and around New Delhi. One is the Aros Paros Museum, which has been set up to archive memory of community university and museums have any by other organizations. And they have been set up in different communities. As you is the Mohalla tangible objects like photographs, letters, and intangible objects like and folklore materials collected from the community, especially the elders, and they have been the community zone. Such the Shadi Khampur, the picture that you see is from Shadi Khampur, which is the Sangrahal Paros, seen at Nizamuddin and Meheroli ki Kisse. So these very small, nice community museums, but they are not permanent. They are temporary community museums that have organizers. They plan into the soon. This is another one. Exhibitions have been on Belize and in local because they don't have much space. Here you can see the community and the younger generation as well in a meeting with the museum community members, and in the Mohalla museums being displayed. And this is the final democratization of underprivileged children at the Aros Paros Sangrahalaya in New Delhi. So where can we see the next community museum next in India? It can be in Sundarban in West Bengal, it can be in Kochi, it can be in Assam, or it can be in Ladakh. However, we are still not sure because a lot of discussion is being carried out the past 20 years, but we are before I leave you, just share with you a very important message from the of the one and community, and please listen carefully to what he has.
At the school for Santa Fe, Mexico. New initiative be set the record straight. We soon and others around the world that the idea of bringing source collections, the idea of between community and museums and the collection was a new level of engagement. This was part of the essence, I think, of guidance for communities to this work as it offers the opportunity to describe with rich detail the objects by the people who made and use them to inform museums based on the values of the communities brought together with creation. Because are learning so much more about themselves, their identity and heritage from museums. It's important for us to engage collections museums are trying to change. All things will change and will respond. And that we are places that enable mediation of knowledges, but also serve as places to create a more informed citizenry. So having said that, we believe that museums should be thinking about how to bring life to objects, those things in their collections, by allowing them to return to their source. And let the community and the museums do that. They may not apply things. Communities may not want many things back in their communities. But let that negotiation happen. Or possibly things are returned. Perhaps are recreated outright. Perhaps communities lost them and returned. I think I had a new way about physiology. Other benefits of communities building relationships with museums is a kind of trust in museums and the staff to enable way learning. So communities can learn from the collections, field of museology, and affect change and recommend change. And also museums can learn from the community about their values around the objects in their collections, how best to handle them. It's a two-way street. This is a paradigm, acknowledging that different knowledges exist.
Quest, places, different areas, different communities. So I'd like to request you to go back to your communities, find local heritage hands-on for yourself. Such an in which I trust me. So really, all of you, and thank the time and the opportunity to speak on this. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Excellent presentation, which enrich us, especially
Thank you, ma'am.
Community Museum. Help us to represent history, especially
Excellent
not only local history,
presentation
but
which
also community
enriched
history,
history,
and how
especially
the
and how the traditional
and eco museum help us.
and
to write
eco
down
museum
history.
help us to write down
It's very
history.
interesting.
It's very interesting,
Enriched.
and we end this.
Madam, just two questions here.
Madam, just two questions here. Can I
Ma'am?
Sure.
tell you?
Yeah.
Ma'am?
Yes,
Yeah.
please. Yes, please.
Dr. Rahul Bhaumik,
Dr. Rahul Bhaumik,
what is question?
what is
How
question?
can
How
eco
can
museum
eco museum
collection enhance
our
about
knowledge about
natural history
natural history
of a
particular geographical region?
Yes.
Ma'am.
This is a very relevant question. Yes.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, ma'am.
Yeah.
You can hear me?
Ma'am, yes.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
This is a very relevant
ma'am.
question that he has put. Thank you for the question. As I said, eco museum involves not only the human or the cultural aspect of a region, but also the natural and the geographical aspect. So as soon as you set up a museum, eco museum in any area, among any community, you are not only nurturing the community's cultural heritage, you are taking care of the natural heritage as well, which includes the geographical heritage. So I think eco museum is one complete package which you can use to prevent a cultural heritage and the natural heritage of an area from degrading into ruin.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Next
Okay,
question.
thank you, ma'am.
Dr.
Next
Mohitos
question,
Dayan,
Dr.
City
Mohitos
College.
Dayan, City College.
Yes, what is the role
Yes,
of
what is
museum
the role of
in the
museum
negative impact
in the negative
of
impact consumerist globalization on social and cultural resource.
Can you repeat the question again, please?
What is the role?
What is the role?
Yeah, ma'am.
What
is the role of museum?
What is the role of museum
in the negative impact?
in the negative impact of
consumerist
globalization,
and cultural resource?
social and cultural resource?
The impact is huge. Not only the impact, I would say the responsibility of the museum is huge. You see, these days we have theme parks and we have shopping malls and we have cinema complexes where the young generation are going away and not visiting the museum. So why is it so? The responsibility lies with the museum to attract the young generation back to its fold. So I think the museums have to change their displays, they have to change their presentations, and they have to be more people friendly to attract them back. That is the way that the negative impact of this consumer society that you just mentioned may be kind of erased from the society.
Okay, ma'am. And another question.
Okay, ma'am. And another question, ma'am.
What is
Another
the role
question.
of a community
What is the role
museum
of a community museum
in improving the well-being
in improving the well-being of the community?
Okay. Well, that is precisely the idea of setting up a community museum is to improve the well-being of the community. The community museum takes a holistic approach to the development of the museum. And if you had listened carefully to what I was saying, the one word that I had used was sustainable. So to make the community museum sustainable and to make the community sustainable, the mutual beneficiary relationship between the community and the museum is very essential, and that is where it ensures the well-being of the community. And since you have a tourism part to this seminar, I would also say community museums also bring in a lot of tourists if they can be handled properly. So tourism can be a good money spinner for community museums as well.
Okay, ma'am. How can we attract more people?
How can we attract more people to study about museum?
Oh, we would love to have as many people in museum study as we can. So we welcome, everybody is welcome to study museology, because once you don't start studying, once you don't start studying museology, you won't know what fun the subject is. So please do come and join the museologists round. Okay.
Okay, ma'am. Many thanks.
Okay, ma'am.
From my core.
Many thanks.
Thank you.
From my core.
It's a great pleasure to us.
It's a great pleasure to us.
It's
a great pleasure talking to you.
Special time for that session.
Thank you so much.
Madam, অসংখ্য ধন্যবাদ।
Thank you for giving so much time to listen to my talk.
ম্যাডাম, অসংখ্য ধন্যবাদ আমাদের কলেজের
যে সত্যি কিভাবে কমিউনিটি
তাই নয়, আজকে আমরা জানলাম যে সত্যি কিভাবে কমিউনিটি ইতিহাস গঠনে সাহায্য করে। তাই নয়, শুধু কমিউনিটি ইতিহাস, কিভাবে প্রশাসনিক লোকাল গভর্নমেন্ট, কিভাবে শাসন ব্যবস্থা, অর্থনৈতিক ব্যবস্থা বা সামাজিক ব্যবস্থা বা তাদের কিভাবে আপগ্রেডেশন মিউজিয়ামের মাধ্যমে তাদের সংস্কৃতির যে বিনিময় ঘটছে গ্লোবাল এরিয়া, সেটা কিন্তু আমরা আজকে জানলাম। সত্যি আমরা উপকৃত হলাম আপনার এই বক্তব্যের মাধ্যমে।
আমি একটাই কথা বলতে চাই,
আপনাকে অসংখ্য ধন্যবাদ আমাদের কলেজের তরফ থেকে। হ্যাঁ ম্যাম বলুন।
একটাই কথা বলতে চাই যে বড় মিউজিয়ামগুলোর কাজ বড় মিউজিয়ামরা করছে, ইন্ডিয়ান মিউজিয়াম, ন্যাশনাল মিউজিয়াম, কিন্তু পাশাপাশি আমাদের এই প্যারালাল কমিউনিটি মিউজিয়াম, আমাদের সঙ্গে প্রফেসর সঞ্জিত জোরদার আছে, ও কাজ করেছে পঞ্চায়েত মিউজিয়াম নিয়ে, এইগুলো কিন্তু আরো বেশি করে আমাদের করা উচিত। তাই জন্য আমাদের অনেকেরই চিন্তা ভাবনা একই দিকে আছে, একটু যদি মাঠে নেমে কাজটা করা যায় তাহলে ভালো হয়।
আমাদের খুবই ইচ্ছা,
কারণ মিউজিয়াম কিন্তু অল সোর্সেস অফ,
কারণ প্রকৃত ইতিহাস যদি লিখতে হয় তাহলে আমাদের যেতে হবে,
মিউজিয়ামে যে আর্টিফ্যাক্টস আছে সেগুলোকে আমাদের লিখতে হবে, এবং সেক্ষেত্রে আমাদের উল্লেখযোগ্য ভূমিকা আছে। শুধুমাত্র প্রথাগতভাবে ইতিহাস লিখলে হবে না, ইতিহাসকে যদি বাস্তবসম্মত, বিজ্ঞান ভিত্তিক, যুক্তিসঙ্গত করতে হয় তাহলে অবশ্যই মিউজিয়ামের দ্বারস্থ হতেই হবে, কারণ মিউজিয়াম অল সোর্সেস অফ। সুতরাং এক্ষেত্রে আমরা খুবই উপকৃত হলাম এবং অসংখ্য ধন্যবাদ পার্টিসিপেন্টদেরও আমি অসংখ্য ধন্যবাদ জানাচ্ছি। আগামীকাল আমরা পাবো ডক্টর মলয় দে, professor, Center for Studies in Museology, University of Jammu, in present, principles of museum documentation. So all are welcome.
We will meet again.
Next day, we will meet again just 5 p.m. Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
অসংখ্য ধন্যবাদ আজকের মতো
থ্যাংক ইউ নিমাই বাবু
থ্যাংক ইউ অল
হ্যাঁ
Okay, we will meet again.
ওকে উইল মিট again.
থ্যাংক ইউ ভেরি মাচ দারুণ
ঠিক আছে এই